Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my 2019 reading statistics video. According to Goodreads, I read 207 books last year, but I will say that those are Goodreads trackable items, and in a lot of cases, when I pulled these statistics, I counted things in groups. I read, for example, a series of 4 novellas by Brian McClellan that are all set in the Powder Mage universe. I will personally count that as one item for most of these. Similarly, I read a series of 4 books by Jason Reynolds in his Track series. I will consider that one item. I read Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips' graphic crime series, Kill or Be Killed, which again, it's 4 items trackable on Goodreads, but I consider that to be essentially one book. I'll start with the source of these books. 86% of the books that I read this year were from the library. I'm always a pretty heavy library user. I almost wondered if it was going to be 90% this year, but not quite. 9% of the books that I read were books that I owned, which included both physical books and ebooks. This year I bought a Kindle, and I think because of that I did buy some of the daily deals, so that increased my owned percentage a little bit. And I have been driving distance to the book outlet store for the past year and a half, so that probably increased it as well. 2% of the books that I read were ARCs that I read through NetGalley. 2% were books that I borrowed from Amazon through Amazon Prime Reading, so you don't buy them, it's essentially a library service. And 1% of the books that I read were books that I borrowed from my mother. Probably mysteries, because that seems to be what I usually borrow from her. So, in terms of what I was reading, the fiction versus nonfiction breakdown was approximately 48% fiction, approximately 45% nonfiction, and the rest was either poetry, where it's difficult to really call something fiction or nonfiction, or was a combination of multiple forms. For example, I read a book that was a collection of Samuel Delany's work, and it included a short story, so fiction, as well as an essay and an interview, which is nonfiction, so stuff like that. But it is a fairly similar number. In terms of the type of book, I suppose, 57% of my reading was long-form prose, and about 14 was short form, so either essay collections or short stories. 20% was sequential art, graphic novels, manga, bande dessinée, etc. And 3% was multiple formats, so for example, illustrated prose or coffee table style books where the photos are as much a part of the content as the writing. That is, I think, a lower percentage of comics than usual, because usually I think my comics reading is about a quarter. So in terms of genre, within the fiction that I read, slightly more than a quarter was general or literary fiction, and slightly more than a quarter was science fiction and fantasy. About 16% was mystery, about 16% was what I'm classifying as children's literature, which is a combination of mostly middle grade and young adult novels. That is not really a genre, but I feel like that should be classified separately from other genres. I don't know. That's just how I did it. 4% were action type pieces, and 1% was horror. Within nonfiction, the biggest category was memoir, that was 32%. Sociology type writing was 18%. History was at 14%. I had 7% each for politics, sports, and literary or arts criticism, which is higher than that usually is. About 5% was travel writing, 4% was food writing, 4% was housekeeping, because I love reading about decluttering, and 1% was finance. In terms of author demographics, 48% of the books that I read were written by women. Approximately 29% were written by men, but I should mention at this point that the numbers are actually probably somewhat closer to equal male and female, just because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there were a number of series that I read where I count them as one item, even though it was actually 4 graphic novels or 3 novels or 4 novels or whatnot. So, and in almost all of those cases, the authors from whom I read multiple books were overwhelmingly male. So there are items here, if I had tracked this differently, it would be closer. 23% of the books that I read were by multiple authors. So this is collections, essay collections that had more than one author, as well as comic collections in which there was more than one author. This includes some collections where both the author and illustrator were male, but the colorist was female. So I feel like some of those would realistically be considered just male, but again, it just depends how you track it. And 1% identified as genders other than male or female. So next up is the ethnicity category, which I don't love because some of them just aren't straightforward. I always say this, when you look at the West Asian and Latin American categories, you can separate that out, but a lot of those include people who are white within their own culture, but wouldn't necessarily be if they were in the United States. So if they're not in the United States, is it appropriate to still classify them different in these other categories? But for the sake of argument, 33% of the authors that I read were white, 28% were Asian, 19% were Black, 8% were First Nations or Indigenous, and 3% were Latin American. Within each of those categories, I read much more heavily West European versus East or South European authors, although I did read a few. I read much more heavily West and South Asian versus Southeast Asian authors. So again, I think the categories are too broad to be super useful, but they're still interesting in general. A surprising number of the Black authors that I read this year were American, so that's interesting. And also 9% of the books that I read were by multiple authors, so multiple backgrounds, and there was a few percent where I didn't know. And I've seen some people who talk about sexuality and religion, but I'm absolutely not doing that because deciding how religiously observant somebody is to classify them as a religion is, I don't know, that just seems grossly inappropriate to me. I mean, there are obviously some people reading and writing expressly religious material, so I would understand classifying that, but I feel like there's a level of judgment associated with that that just seems wrong. And similarly with sexuality. People can be closeted. You can't just assume based on relationships. No, not doing that. Let's talk about the original language in which these books were written. 85% of the books that I read this year were originally written in English, which is higher than I would like it to be. I prefer it to be between 75 and 80%, but not the end of the world. So of the books that were written in languages other than English, 42% of them were originally written in French, 13% in Spanish, 10% each in Turkish, Russian, and Japanese, 6% in Arabic, and then I read one book that was originally written in Italian, one book that was translated from Finnish, and one book that was translated from Farsi, which I suppose is a reasonable spread of languages. I don't know what I want to do with that in particular, so. Finally, format. Probably should have put this earlier. 51% of the books that I read were physical books, 41% were ebooks, and 8% were audiobooks, which I think is a fairly standard distribution of those for me. I don't necessarily want to do anything with those numbers. I think half and half is pretty reasonable. I feel like that's maybe a slightly lower percentage of audiobooks, but my issue now is that because I really only listen to audiobooks when I'm walking the dog, I tend to be walking in areas where I need to pay more attention now than I was when I used to walk on this outdoor loop that I used to when I lived in Houston. And because I need to pay attention, I just can't listen to them as much. So the number is going to stay low unless I'm back somewhere on a loop with no traffic. Anyway, I think that was kind of interesting. We'll see. I don't know if that's interesting to anyone else, but I found the numbers fun to look at. All right, if you've pulled your reading stats, were you surprised by any of them? Do you enjoy these stats videos? I love watching other people's stats videos, but I know that some people find them boring. So I'd be curious if you find them as interesting as I do. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.